Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. What if I told you the global elite were more evil than you think? You'd probably say, oh no, George, that's impossible. I've done my research, I've done my homework. I understand that these people are really bad. They're central planners. They want to take us to this great reset agenda where you will own nothing and you'll be happy by the year 2030. And that may be true, but it's a lot deeper than that once you start doing some research. So let's dive right in and I'll show you what I'm referring to. First, let's go to the World Economic Forum's website. And this is a 280-page paper that I have been reading this morning. And it gives just basically a step-by-step biography of the World Economic Forum going back to 1971 when Klaus Schwab set it up. And it's kind of a year-by-year summary of what happened in chronological order. And this actually goes to 2010. So it's from 1971 to 2010. And let's see, we'll go to the top really quick here. So if you guys want to check this out yourself, you can. It's and again, this is on the World Economic Forum's website, so this isn't hasn't been edited. This isn't fake news or anything like that. It's the World Economic Forum, a partner in shaping history, the first 40 years. And so if we go, it's got just, there you go. It's got their stamp. I mean, they wrote this. It's basically to make this gentleman look like a hero. And if we go to page 25, that's really what I want to focus on first. And there is Klaus Schwab's wife. And that is Klaus Schwab, believe it or not. And here he is at one of actually the first World Economic Forum. It wasn't called the World Economic Forum back then. I believe it was called the European Management Symposium. And interestingly enough, 1973, the year I was born, that's what I want to focus on first. And they state here in the document, I'll try to expand this. Two developments distinguished this Davos meeting. First, Arlio Pecci, the Italian industrialist, delivered a speech summarizing the limits to growth. Now, if you're not familiar with this gentleman, he was he might have started another organization in 1968 that they highlight here in the post called the Club of Rome. And we'll get into that in just a moment. The global think tank that he found, I guess he did found it, and served as president. The study had caused a sensation after its publication in 1972 for calling into question the sustainability of global economic growth, reiterating some of the same concerns about demographics that the 18th century scholar Thomas Malthus had expressed. The authors examined several scenarios for the global economy and outlined the choices that society had to make to reconcile economic development and environmental constraints. The landmark publication was eventually translated into some 30 languages and sold more than 12 million copies. So basically what this was is this Club of Rome was set up on the premise that the global population would continue to grow exponentially, but we were living in a world with limited resources. And therefore, if you're basing it on the teachings of Thomas Malthus, this is Malthusianism, you've got a few different options. Either you've got to reduce the population, or you've got to reduce the levels of consumption. And it's very consistent, the Club of Rome, their ideas, which basically, they still exist today, the Club of Rome, and it's pretty much just the same garbage, just reiterated over and over and over again, and just kind of repackaged. In fact, they've come out with multiple books and papers since this limits to growth, and they're all pretty much the exact same thing. It's just they do it every 10 years and just basically kind of revise this first paper that they did. And it's really this premise that, the population's doing this, growing exponentially. It's limitless, the population growth, but yet we live in a world that has limited resources. Therefore, what do you do? And again, the conclusion that Malthus had, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, it's this idea of Malthusianism, was that you had to reduce the population or you have to reduce consumption. And it really wasn't an original idea. I think that goes back to 18th century. So now let's fast forward a little bit and try to dive into the Club of Rome. This was founded in 1968 in Italy, of course. It consists of 100 members selected from current and former heads of state, government, UN administrators, high-level politicians, governments, officials, diplomats, scientists, economists, and business leaders from around the globe. Sounds a lot like the World Economic Forum, doesn't it? It's interesting that these central planners and authoritarians all set up the same types of groups. And what's fascinating is now the Club of Rome is headquartered in Switzerland, which, if you had to guess, where would you say the World Economic Forum was headquartered? Yes, that's right, Switzerland. Moving on down the Wikipedia post. So central to the formation of the club was Péchy's, and this is the gentleman that spoke at the World Economic Forum in 1972. And I believe that this really shaped Klaus's views, because he basically takes this concept and integrates it into everything that they set up as their worldview. I mean, it's really the keystone of the Great Reset agenda. So going back to 72, this Péchy gentleman, the concept of problematic is what he referred to it as. It was his opinion that viewing the problems of humankind, environmental deterioration, poverty, endemic ill health, weird, urban blight, criminality, individually in isolation, or as problems capable of being solved in their own terms, was doomed to failure. Let's unpack this a little bit. So what is he saying here? He's saying that you have these problems and they won't be solved by the plebs. This won't be solved by a decentralized approach. This can only be solved by a one world government. And this is where Mr. Henry Kissinger comes into play. Someone who is extremely influential to Klaus Schwab. He was one of his teachers at Harvard, I believe in 1967, 1968. And he had this organization at Harvard, Kissinger did, and Klaus was a big part of that organization. And then in 1980, going back to the article I started with, you'll see that Kissinger gave a speech at the World Economic Forum where he said pretty much the same thing, that the world's problems would only be solved by a global government. And it sounds very consistent with what the World Economic Forum has been saying recently as well. And it's obviously very consistent with the Great Reset agenda. So going back to this gentleman in 1972 here, again, what he's saying is that we have to have a central approach to solving these problems. The global elite, the intelligentsia, the few people, the enlightened few at the top, they have to make decisions for the entire globe, for humankind. Because people left to their own devices, just the plebs and the rubes out there, like you and I, if these problems are put on our lap to solve, then the world is doomed to failure. So this goes straight to the core of the debate between a centralized approach and a decentralized approach. They're central planners. It goes straight back to when they set up the World Economic Forum in 1971. It was a cornerstone of their worldview and their belief system back then, and it is definitely a cornerstone of what they believe in today. And some of these fundamentals are expressed in this Club of Rome in Malthusianism, and pretty much the idea, and it all revolves around limitless population growth and limited resources. And then believing that there are a few people that are just smarter than everyone else and understand this, and therefore they should be calling the shots. They should be controlling not just a specific city or state or country, but the entire world and the entire global population. Oh, but wait, there is more, as you would imagine. So let's dive into their view that the limits to growth and how they've not really expanded on this view, but some of the things they've added to it over the past decades. So the Club of Rome stimulated considerable public attention with the first report to the club, The Limits of Growth, published in 72. We talked about that. Even before The Limits of Growth was published, Edward Pastel and Mijlo Mezrovic, the case of Case Western Reserve University, had begun work far more elaborate model. So they talk about these models that these guys are setting up to show that the world will run out of resources. Pretty much, again, Malthusianism. In 1991, the club published the first Global Revolution. So this is the Club of Rome again. It analyzes the problem of humanity, calling these collective or essence the problematic. Now, this goes back to what the founder was talking about in 1972. It notes that historically, social political unity has commonly been motivated by enemies in common. That sound familiar? The need for enemies seems to be a common historical factor. This is a quote from their report, the one in 91. Some states have striven to overcome domestic failure and internal contradictions by blaming external enemies. So, if you've got a really bad problem with inflation and no one really likes you, even the people that voted for you, what should you do? That's right. You should create a boogeyman. You should create an external enemy. Moving on with their quote. The ploy of finding a scapegoat is as old as mankind itself. When things become too difficult at home, divert attention to adventure abroad. Bring the divided nation together to face an outside enemy. Either a real one or else one invented for the purpose. With the disappearance of traditional enemy, the temptation is to use religious or ethnic minorities as scapegoats, especially those whose differences from the majority are disturbing. Disturbing. That's an interesting word to use, isn't it? Especially when you're talking about other people, that there's a difference that someone could have, like the food they eat is, or the way they smell, or the way they look is disturbing. I mean, that word in and of itself tells you the mindset of these people. But continuing on with another quote, every state has so used to classifying its neighbors as friend or foe that the sudden absence of traditional adversaries has left governments and public opinion with a great void to fill. Now keep in mind, this is 1991. New enemies have to be identified. Let me say that one more time here, and this is within their quote here. New enemies have to be identified, new strategies imagined, and new weapons devised. In searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, they're talking about themselves, the Club of Rome, came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. In their totality and their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat. So they say, well, they are a threat, and they do need to be confronted. But what they're saying is they are using these threats to serve a much greater purpose, and a purpose that is good for them and bad for you and I. And they say all of these dangers are caused by human intervention in natural processes. And it is only through changed attitudes and behavior they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. So I'll let you just mull over that for a moment here as I scroll down. In fact, why don't I just say that one more time here so everyone got it. In searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. They conclude by saying the real enemy, then, is humanity itself. So I wanted to point out that they've had some notable members, one of which was this gentleman with the last name of Trudeau, first name Pierre. So not Justin, but Pierre. Wonder if there's a relationship there. Of course, you guys know Pierre Trudeau was Justin Trudeau's father and former Prime Minister of Canada. I just thought that was interesting. So basically the point I'm trying to make, and I could go on and on about the research I've done this morning, but I'll probably save it for a whiteboard video this week, is when you hear the global elite talk about how we need to change global warming, this is all utter BS. These are lies. They don't care about global warming. Now, what they do care about is exponential or limitless population growth in a world of limited resources. They're all Malthusians. This is what their true concern is. And because they are central planners, they believe that the only solution is to reduce the population or reduce consumption. So how do you reduce consumption? Well, according to the Club of Rome, you have to create some common enemy. In their case, they suggested pollution, climate change. See, this is the common enemy. So if we can target something that's 50 years into the future, that's very abstract and very difficult to measure, if not impossible, then we can force the global population to consume less. And if we force the global population to consume less, and maybe we kill a couple billion people in the process, then this solves the problem that was presented all the way back at the World Economic Forum in 1973 by the gentleman that started the Club of Rome, that really got his ideas from Thomas Malthus. See, this is what we're dealing with, guys. And so I think you've got to understand their worldview to understand how we can push back and make sure that their objectives don't come to fruition, because their objectives involve basically the global population, 7 billion people, being micromanaged by the global elite like cattle. And that's not a world that I want to live in. I don't think that's a world that you want to live in. And it's definitely not a world that we want to leave to our kids and grandkids. So I'll continue to do more research on this and share with you guys what I find, and probably turn it into a whiteboard video. So on that note, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Make sure that you're always standing up for freedom, liberty, free market capitalism, which is decentralized. This is the way we're going to solve these problems of living in a world of limited resources, is through a decentralized approach. The only thing that's going to happen with a centralized approach is potentially the destruction of the global economy as we know it, and potentially billions of people losing their lives. We'll see you in the next video.